They thought the storm would erase everything: a frozen ravine, a silenced crime, a woman left to die in the snow. He was just a worn-out veteran, a man with nothing left but an old German shepherd at his side, driving home when his dog suddenly heard something no one else could. What they found below wasn't an accident. It was cruelty, abandonment, and 3 newborn puppies fighting for their very first breath. He could have walked away. No one would have blamed him. But that night, in the middle of the storm, God placed a choice in his hands. And that choice became a quiet miracle. If you believe miracles still happen in the darkest nights, subscribe to this channel and stay with us. Snow fell sideways under a sky the color of bruised steel, the wind clawing at the empty highway as if trying to erase it entirely, turning distance into a white blur and sound into a low, constant howl that pressed against the chest. Ethan Walker drove with both hands tight on the steering wheel, shoulders hunched forward not from fear, but from habit, the way men learn to fold themselves inward after years of bracing against things they could not stop. At 46, he looked older than the number suggested. Deep lines carved around his mouth, a permanent crease between his brows, and a heaviness in his eyes that came not from age, but from accumulation. His hair, once a dark brown, had gone mostly iron gray at the temples, cropped short in a way that suggested the military, even though no uniform clung to his body anymore. A close, uneven beard covered his jaw, more neglect than style, softening the sharp angles of his face without hiding them. His nose had been broken once and healed slightly off-center. His knuckles were thick and scarred, the hands of a man who fixed things because fixing people had proven harder. Ethan was built solid rather than tall, broad through the shoulders from years of carrying weight, packs, tools, responsibility. And though he moved slower now, there was still a coiled strength beneath the fatigue, like a spring that had been compressed too long. He worked nights doing manual labor wherever he could find it, towing stranded vehicles, clearing snow, repairing what wealthier people could afford to replace. Jobs that paid just enough to keep the lights on in the narrow room he rented beside an aging garage on the edge of town. He did not complain about the work. He complained only in silence to himself about how little of it remained when the bills were paid. The cab smelled faintly of oil, wet wool, and old coffee. On the passenger side sat Rex, a German shepherd well past his prime, his muzzle graying almost to white, his ears nicked and scarred from years of service and weather. Rex was large even for his breed, with a sable coat darkened along the spine and lighter along the flanks. His body lean but no longer sleek, the muscles of his hind legs softened by age. One of his eyes bore a faint clouding at the edge, the kind that came with time, but his gaze remained sharp, alert in a way that went beyond sight. At 10 years old, Rex moved with the deliberate care of a veteran who knew exactly how much effort each step cost and whether it was worth spending. He had once been a search and rescue dog, trained to find breathing beneath rubble and snow, to ignore panic and focus on the smallest trace of life. Now he was retired, officially, though his instincts had never accepted the paperwork. Rex did not fidget or whine. He simply watched, head resting low, body relaxed but ready, as if the world might call on him again at any moment. Ethan glanced at him briefly, a habit as ingrained as checking the mirrors. Rex had been with him longer than any human had stayed, longer than his marriage, which had collapsed quietly under the weight of missed words and unshared grief, longer than the men from his unit, scattered or buried after the war ended and life resumed for everyone, except those who had brought the war home in their bones. The two of them had met years earlier, after Ethan's discharge, when the nightmares had been worst and the days had felt like thin ice over deep water. Rex had been assigned to a county rescue program. Ethan had been volunteering because sleeping at night felt impossible anyway. They recognized something in each other then, a familiar tension, a shared patience with silence. When Rex aged out and the county downsized, Ethan took him in without hesitation. He never said it aloud, but everyone who saw them together understood. The dog had saved him as much as he had ever saved anyone. The road was nearly empty, the kind of empty that came when people with warm homes and better options stayed inside. Snow plows had passed hours earlier, but the wind had already undone their work, piling drifts along the shoulders and erasing the lines. Ethan drove slower than he needed to, his body tired from a long shift, his mind drifting in the dangerous way it did when exhaustion loosened its grip. Thoughts came uninvited then. The crack of gunfire echoing down narrow streets half a world away, the sudden weightlessness after an explosion, the sound of someone calling his name and not answering when he called back. He had learned to let the thoughts pass, not fight them, but nights like this made that harder. Nights like this made it tempting to believe that if he simply kept driving, kept working until his body gave out, he might finally outrun the quiet. Rex lifted his head suddenly. It was not abrupt, not panicked, but it was decisive. His ears angled forward, his body stiffening in a way Ethan recognized instantly. "What is it, boy?" Ethan murmured, his voice rough from disuse. Rex did not look at him. He leaned forward instead, nose lifting, testing the air through the small gap in the cracked window. The wind carried snow and cold and the sharp mineral scent of ice. But beneath it all, Rex caught something else, something wrong. He let out a low, controlled growl, not a warning, but a question. Ethan felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the old instinct flaring despite himself. He slowed, easing the truck toward the shoulder. "It's nothing," he said, more to himself than the dog. He was tired. He had already given everything he had tonight. Whatever Rex thought he heard or smelled was probably debris shifting, a tree branch snapping under ice, the kind of thing the mountains did all the time without caring who noticed. Ethan put his foot back on the accelerator. Rex stood, not fully, but enough that his weight shifted forward, the harness strap pulling taut. He did not bark. He did not panic. He simply turned his head toward a barely visible side road, half buried by snow, then looked back at Ethan, eyes steady and intent. There was no pleading in that look, no excitement. There was only certainty. Ethan swore softly under his breath. His shoulders sagged as if the argument had already been lost. He pulled the truck to a stop, the engine idling in protest. "You're sure?" he asked, absurdly, because he always asked, because asking gave him the illusion of choice. Rex held his gaze, tail still, body aligned toward the road that disappeared into white. Ethan rested his forehead briefly against the steering wheel. He thought of the warmth waiting in his room, the cracked ceiling, the narrow bed that would hold him for a few hours before the next shift. He thought of the ache in his lower back, the dull throb in his left knee where old shrapnel still complained when the weather turned. He thought of how easy it would be to drive on, to tell himself that someone else would handle whatever Rex sensed, that it was not his responsibility anymore. That was what people said when they wanted to sleep at night. Not my responsibility, not my problem, not today. But Rex did not move. He waited. He always waited. "All right," Ethan said finally, the word carrying more weight than it should have. He turned the wheel, easing the truck onto the unplowed road, tires crunching over ice. The headlights cut a narrow tunnel through the snow, revealing nothing but swirling white and the faint suggestion of trees beyond. As they drove, Ethan felt a familiar, unwelcome stirring beneath the fatigue, a quiet alertness, a readiness he had thought he'd buried. He did not know where the road would lead or what waited at its end. He only knew that if he ignored Rex now, he would carry that choice with him far longer than the cold. The truck crawled forward, swallowed by the storm, as man and dog followed a feeling neither of them could name, unaware that this small deviation, this single exhausted decision made on a winter night, was about to draw them into a story far larger than either had intended, one that would test what little they had left and remind them, painfully and gently, why they had survived in the first place. The ravine opened beneath the trees like a wound the land had never bothered to close, its steep sides glazed with ice and blown smooth by weeks of wind. Ethan killed the engine and stepped out, the cold slamming into him with a physical force that stole his breath. Snow whispered down the slope in thin sheets, sliding rather than falling, and somewhere below that constant hiss lay the reason Rex had stopped him. Rex was already ahead, moving with careful confidence, his paws finding purchase where Ethan's boots slipped. He did not rush. He descended as if he had done this many times before, head low, nose working, every sense tuned to something Ethan could not yet see. The wreck revealed itself slowly, first as a dark shape that did not belong, then as the unmistakable outline of a vehicle lying at an angle no road would ever allow. It was a patrol car, its roof crushed inward, its rear end twisted against a cluster of frozen rocks. The word police, half buried under ice, caught the beam of Ethan's flashlight and reflected back at him, warped and dull. His stomach tightened. Accidents happened, even to trained drivers, but something about the placement felt wrong, too deliberate, too final, as if the car had been sent here rather than lost. Ethan picked his way down the last stretch, knees protesting, boots skidding. Rex stopped at the driver's side, hackles raised just enough to signal concern without panic. The driver's window was shattered, its edges rimmed with frost, and inside the cab hung a woman, suspended upside down by her seat belt. She was young, maybe early 30s, her dark hair pulled back in a practical knot that had come loose, strands plastered to her pale face by blood and melted snow. Her skin held a bluish cast, lips slightly parted, breath faint enough that Ethan had to lean close to be sure it existed. She wore a standard-issue winter uniform, the fabric stiff with ice, the badge in her chest dulled by frost. A deep gash split her temple, blood frozen in uneven streaks along her cheek. "Hey," Ethan said softly, as if volume might make the damage worse. His voice sounded small in the open air. He reached in, fingers numb even through his gloves, and felt for a pulse at her neck. It was there, thin, irregular, but present. Relief washed through him so suddenly it made his knees weak. He moved to cut the seat belt, bracing her weight with his shoulder, when the beam of his flashlight caught something else, something that made him freeze. Her left wrist was cuffed to the steering column, the metal bright and clean against the dark interior. This was no accident. No slide on ice ended like this. Rex growled then, low and urgent, and darted toward the rear of the vehicle. The sound he made next was different, a strained whine that twisted something deep in Ethan's chest. "Easy, boy," Ethan murmured, though his heart had begun to race. He followed Rex's line of sight to the cargo area, where a K9 transport crate lay crumpled but intact. The door hung partially open, bent inward. Inside, pressed together in a tight, desperate knot, were 3 German shepherd puppies, no more than a few weeks old. Their coats were damp and flattened, their bodies rigid with cold. One lifted its head weakly and let out a thin, broken sound before collapsing back against the others. "Oh, no," Ethan breathed. He had seen injury. He had seen death. This was different. This was smaller, quieter, and somehow harder to bear. He did not hesitate. He shrugged out of his heavy jacket, unzipped his inner layers, and scooped the puppies against his chest, their bodies shockingly light, their skin icy even through fur. He tucked them beneath his shirt, pulling fabric tight to trap what little warmth he had. Rex hovered close, his nose nudging one tiny back, his breath fogging in short, anxious bursts. Ethan forced himself back to the driver's side. He cut the seatbelt carefully, supporting the woman as she sagged, then searched the footwell until his fingers closed around a small ring of keys. He fumbled, hands shaking, before finding the cuff key and turning it. The click sounded unnaturally loud. He freed her wrist and eased her out, lifting her with a grunt as pain flared through his back. She was lighter than she should have been, her body limp with cold. He shifted her over his shoulder in a fireman's carry, the puppies pressed tight against his ribs, their breathing shallow but steady enough to keep hope alive. The climb back up was slow and punishing. Snow slid underfoot, threatening to pull him down again with every step. His lungs burned, each breath a sharp reminder of his limits. More than once, a thought crept in uninvited. "You are too old, too tired, too broken for this." Each time, Rex looked back at him, eyes steady, and the thought dissolved. Ethan focused on small things. One step, one breath, the weight on his shoulder, the warmth under his shirt. He did not think about the handcuffs or the blood, or the fact that whoever had done this might not be far away. Thinking like that led nowhere useful. By the time he reached the truck, his hands were trembling uncontrollably. He eased the woman into the back seat, wrapping her in spare blankets, then climbed in himself, cradling the puppies against the heater vents, turning the dial as high as it would go. The cab filled with the smell of wet fur and old fabric, a strangely comforting scent. Rex jumped in beside him, placing his body close, sharing heat without being asked. Ethan drove back toward town at a careful crawl, eyes straining against the white, his mind a tight knot of focus and doubt. He had no medical gear, no plan beyond getting them somewhere warm. He kept thinking of the garage, of the small space behind it that held a battered couch, a working heater, and not much else. It would have to be enough. The garage door groaned as he forced it open, snow piling at his feet. Inside, the space was dim but sheltered, the concrete floor cold under his boots. He carried the woman inside first, laying her carefully on the couch, elevating her legs with a crate. Up close he could see more clearly. She was tall and lean, her build athletic without bulk, the kind that came from long hours of training rather than a gym. Her skin was fair beneath the grime and blood, freckles faint across her nose. Even unconscious, there was a tension in her posture, as if she were bracing for a blow that had already landed. He guessed her name from the badge pinned to her jacket, Hannah Brooks, and repeated it quietly, grounding it in his mind. He turned to the puppies next, laying them in a shallow box lined with rags, placing it near the heater, but not too close. He rubbed them gently, steadily, the way he had been taught long ago for hypothermia, coaxing circulation back into their tiny bodies. One let out a small, indignant squeak. Ethan laughed then, a rough, surprised sound that caught in his throat. Rex lay down beside the box, his massive head resting on the edge, eyes never leaving the small, fragile forms. As Ethan worked, fear crept in, not the sharp, immediate kind, but a heavy, lingering weight. He did not know how long Hannah had been out there. He did not know if she would wake. He did not know what would happen if someone came looking for her and found his garage instead. He only knew that turning away had never sat well with him, and that tonight at least he had chosen to stay. Hannah did not wake before the chapter ended. The puppies slept fitfully, their breathing shallow but present. The storm howled outside, indifferent to what it had almost taken. Inside the garage, under flickering fluorescent light, a tired man and an older dog kept watch, bound together by a simple, stubborn refusal to let the night decide how the story would end. Hannah woke to warmth first, a dull, unfamiliar heat seeping into her bones, followed by the smell of old oil, dust, and something faintly metallic. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, pupils struggling against the weak yellow light buzzing overhead. The ceiling above her was low and cracked, stained by years of leaks and neglect, a single fluorescent tube flickering as if unsure whether to stay alive. Pain arrived next, sharp and insistent, radiating from her temple, down her neck, and into her ribs. She sucked in a breath and immediately regretted it. She tried to move and failed. Panic rose fast, trained and automatic, but before it could crest, a calm, unfamiliar voice cut through it. "Easy," Ethan said, his tone steady but tired, the voice of a man who had learned long ago that fear only wasted energy. Hannah turned her head slightly and saw him standing a few feet away, leaning against a workbench cluttered with tools, his broad shoulders hunched, arms crossed tightly, as if holding himself together. In the dim light, she noticed details she hadn't before. The deep scar along his forearm, the stiffness in his posture, the way his eyes never quite rested, always tracking, assessing. He looked like someone who had been awake for far too long. "You're safe," he continued. "You're in my garage. Storm's still bad." Hannah swallowed, her throat dry and raw. Memories rushed back in fragments. The road, the sudden stop, a familiar voice that wasn't kind anymore, the cold metal biting into her wrist. Her gaze dropped instinctively to her hands. They were free now, wrapped in mismatched blankets, her fingers swollen and bruised but no longer restrained. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "My dogs," she whispered, the words scraping out of her chest. Ethan didn't answer right away. He stepped aside, revealing a shallow wooden box near the heater. 3 small shapes lay inside, pressed together, their tiny bodies rising and falling in uneven rhythm. One stirred, letting out a soft, complaining sound. Tears blurred Hannah's vision before she could stop them. "They're alive," Ethan said quietly. "Barely, but alive." Only then did she allow herself to truly look at him, this stranger who had carried her out of a ravine and brought her here. He was not handsome in any polished way. His face was rough, weathered, the lines etched deep by exposure and disappointment rather than age. His beard was uneven, his hair peppered with gray, his clothes practical and worn thin. There was nothing impressive about him at first glance, no badge, no uniform, no visible authority. And yet, the way he stood between her and the door, the way he spoke without asking for thanks, told her everything she needed to know. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice breaking despite her effort to control it. Ethan nodded once, uncomfortable with gratitude, then turned his attention to Rex. The old German shepherd lay near the door, head up, ears angled toward the outside world. His coat was dull with age, but still thick, his frame large and imposing even at rest. One eye followed Hannah briefly, then returned to the door. He was not guarding her so much as guarding the space itself, a silent agreement between dog and man. Hannah shifted carefully, wincing. "He's beautiful," she murmured. "He's old," Ethan corrected gently. "But yeah, he's good." Silence settled between them, heavy but not hostile. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, wind rattling the thin metal walls. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and then faded, swallowed by snow. That sound, faint as it was, tightened something in Hannah's chest. "They're not looking for me," she said, more statement than question. Ethan met her eyes. "They will," he said. "Just not the way you'd hope." She closed her eyes, the truth settling like a weight. When she spoke again, her voice was flat, stripped of illusion. "Daniel Mercer did this?" The name hung in the air. Ethan did not recognize it, but the way Hannah said it, careful, precise, as if each syllable had teeth, told him enough. "He's my captain," she continued. "Mid-40s, tall, always smiling, clean-cut, the kind of man people trust without thinking twice. He shakes hands like he's grateful you exist." She laughed softly, bitter. "I used to admire him." Mercer had been everything the department praised, charismatic, articulate, generous with credit. He'd worn his authority lightly, never raised his voice, never seemed angry. That was what had made it possible. That was how he'd built a system that moved contraband under the guise of routine operations, using official routes no one dared question. Hannah had found it slowly, painfully, following discrepancies no one else cared enough to chase. When she realized the scope of it, she'd felt sick. When she realized who was behind it, she'd felt alone. "I was going to report it," she said. "Internal affairs. Federal if I had to. I didn't even get that far." Her jaw tightened. "He called me, said there was a problem on the road, that he needed me to check something before the storm hit. I trusted him." Ethan listened without interrupting. He had learned long ago that people told the truth more easily when they weren't rushed. "They won't tell this story," Hannah went on. "They'll say I panicked, that I cracked under pressure, maybe that I hurt someone." Her eyes opened, sharp despite the pain. "They'll make me the problem." As if summoned by her words, Ethan's phone buzzed on the workbench. The sound was jarring in the small space. He hesitated, then picked it up, squinting at the cracked screen. Signal was weak, but a notification had slipped through. A local news alert. He turned the phone toward Hannah. The headline was brief and devastating. "Local officer missing amid blizzard. Authorities express concern for mental health." Hannah closed her eyes again. "There it is," she whispered. "The first shovel of dirt." Ethan felt a cold anger settle in his gut, slower and heavier than rage. He had seen this before, in different uniforms, different cities. Systems protected themselves. Individuals were expendable. "If we go outside," he said slowly, "they'll already know what they're supposed to see." "Yes," Hannah said, "and they won't see the truth." Rex shifted then, rising to his feet, hackles lifting just slightly. He moved to the door, nose low, listening. Ethan's hand tightened unconsciously around the edge of the bench. "What is it?" he asked. Rex did not bark. He simply stood there, body tense, a quiet warning. There were sounds beyond the storm now, faint but distinct, the crunch of tires somewhere distant, the echo of voices carried on the wind. Not close. Not yet. Hannah watched the dog, understanding immediately. "They're coming," she said. "Eventually," Ethan agreed. He looked around the garage, the thin walls, the inadequate locks, the small, fragile lives sleeping in a box near a heater. He felt the weight of his own insignificance press down on him. No badge, no allies, no proof, just a choice. "We can't run," he said at last, "and we can't explain." Hannah nodded, tears slipping down her temples into her hair. "Then we wait." Rex lay back down at the door, settling in as if he had been given an order. The storm raged on, burying roads and signals alike, and in that narrow space carved out of neglect and stubbornness, truth had nowhere to stand. But it was still alive, breathing quietly, waiting for daylight. Daniel Mercer arrived just after midnight, not with sirens or a convoy, but in the quiet way men do when they believe the night is on their side. The crunch of tires outside the garage cut through the wind, deliberate and unhurried, followed by the soft closing of a car door. Ethan heard it all from his place near the workbench, every sound amplified by tension. Rex felt it sooner. The old German shepherd lifted his head, ears pricked, body going still in a way that told Ethan this was not a passerby. This was intention. Mercer knocked once, firmly, as if he owned the answer already. When Ethan opened the door a few inches, cold rushed in, along with the smell of snow and cologne, expensive, restrained. Mercer stood under the flickering security light, tall and straight despite the weather, his dark hair neatly combed beneath a wool cap. His face was clean-shaven, his jaw sharp, his smile practiced to the point of muscle memory. He wore a heavy coat that fit him perfectly, the kind tailored to suggest authority without announcing it. Even at rest, his posture radiated confidence, the kind that came from years of being believed. "Evening," Mercer said, voice warm, eyes scanning past Ethan into the garage. "Sorry to bother you this late. We're checking on everyone in the area. Dangerous storm." Ethan shrugged, letting his shoulders slump, letting weariness shape him. "Just me," he said, trying to keep the heater running. Mercer nodded sympathetically, as if they were equals sharing a minor inconvenience. "I understand. Mind if I come in for a moment? We've got an officer unaccounted for. Just making sure she didn't stop somewhere to get warm." The words were careful, not accusation, not yet. Ethan hesitated, then stepped aside enough to allow Mercer a partial view, but not entry. "Place is a mess," he said. "Not much to see." Mercer smiled again, softer this time. Messy places are usually honest places. He leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing as they adjusted to the dim light. His gaze drifted to the far wall, to the heater, to the shallow box near it. Rex shifted then, rising just enough for his bulk to be visible in the shadows. A low rumble escaped his chest, not a bark, not a threat, but a boundary. Mercer paused. His eyes flicked to the dog, then back to Ethan. "That's a big shepherd," he said lightly. "Friendly?" "He's old," Ethan replied. "Doesn't like strangers." Mercer chuckled. "The sound easy." "Neither do I." He took a step closer, boots crossing the threshold. Rex's growl deepened, just a fraction. Ethan moved instinctively, placing himself between Mercer and the interior, one hand resting on the doorframe. "Best he stays where he is," Ethan said. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it now, a subtle shift Mercer noticed. For a brief moment, something cold passed over Mercer's face. It was gone almost immediately, replaced by concern. "I get it," he said. "No trouble intended." He stepped back, hands visible, palms open. "If you see or hear anything, give us a call. We're worried about her. She's had a rough year." Ethan said nothing. He watched Mercer turn away, watched him walk back to his car without hurry. The engine started, idled, then cut again. Mercer stepped out once more, leaning against the hood as if reconsidering. "Storm's not letting up," he called. "Be careful." When the car finally drove off, the silence that followed was heavier than the noise had been. Ethan closed the door and leaned against it, his legs suddenly unsteady. Rex moved to his side, pressing his weight briefly into Ethan's thigh, grounding him. In the corner, Hannah had not moved. She sat on the floor behind a stack of crates, her back against the wall, breath shallow, eyes wide. She had seen Mercer's face clearly through a crack, had recognized the way his voice shifted when he thought he was alone. Her hand shook as she reached into the collar of the smallest puppy, her fingers finding the tiny seam she'd stitched weeks earlier on instinct alone. Inside was the microdrive, no larger than a fingernail, the sum total of everything she had risked her life to collect. Ethan turned to her as she held it up, the dim light catching its matte surface. "Is that it?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "If this doesn't get out, none of it matters." Ethan glanced at his phone, then at the ancient laptop on the workbench, its screen cracked, battery unreliable. Signal was weak, but not dead. "Try," he said. "Once." Hannah swallowed and connected the drive, fingers moving with painful slowness. The upload crawled, each percentage point a small mercy. Outside, the wind howled as if impatient. Halfway through, a noise from the box made Ethan's heart lurch. The smallest puppy had gone still. Too still. Ethan crossed the space in 2 strides, kneeling, hands gentle but firm as he lifted the tiny body. The pup's gums were pale, its breath barely perceptible. He rubbed it briskly, breathing warmth into its fur, whispering nonsense he hadn't spoken aloud in years. Rex hovered close, whining softly, his nose nudging the pup's side. "Come on," Ethan murmured. "Not tonight." Minutes stretched. The laptop chimed softly. Upload complete. Hannah slumped against the wall, relief and terror tangling together. At the same moment, the puppy twitched, a weak squeak escaping its mouth. Ethan laughed again, a broken sound that bordered on a sob. He placed the pup back with its siblings, watching as it nestled in, still alive. The night wore on. Mercer did not return, but his presence lingered, a threat pressed into the walls. Ethan's knuckles bore fresh cuts from where he'd scraped them earlier, a small price for blocking the door when Mercer had leaned in too close. He rapped them absently, pain distant. No one slept. Rex remained at his post, eyes never fully closing. By morning, the storm began to ease, light creeping into the cracks. They were exhausted, bruised, shaken, but intact. No victory had been claimed, nothing had been resolved. They had simply endured, holding the line with what little they had, long enough to let the truth slip into the world beyond the snow. Morning did not arrive all at once. It crept in cautiously, as if unsure it was welcome, thinning the darkness until shapes took form and the world remembered how to breathe. The wind eased first, then the snow softened, falling straight down instead of sideways, and finally the silence broke into a fragile calm that felt earned. Ethan stood by the open garage door with a mug of reheated coffee cradled between his palms, watching the pale light spread across the lot. His face looked older in daylight, the lines more honest, the fatigue no longer hidden by shadow. But there was something else there, too, an unguarded quiet that hadn't been present the night before. Rex lay near the threshold, stretched out with his head on his paws, eyes half closed but attentive. In the warmth of morning, the gray in his muzzle was unmistakable, his age undeniable, yet his presence filled the space with a steady confidence. Behind them, the garage smelled of clean heat and damp fur, of survival rather than fear. Hannah sat on the couch with a blanket around her shoulders, her posture straighter than it had been hours earlier, pain still present but no longer in control. Her hair, once tightly pulled back, now fell loosely around her face, dark strands framing eyes that were tired yet focused. In the clear light, she looked younger, almost fragile, but the set of her jaw betrayed a resilience sharpened by betrayal. The sound of tires approached slowly, deliberately. Not the aggressive crunch of Mercer's arrival the night before, but something measured, respectful. Ethan did not tense. He watched as two vehicles stopped at the edge of the property, unmarked, practical. A woman stepped out first, tall and lean, her movements efficient without being hurried. She wore a dark jacket over plain clothes, her auburn hair pulled into a low knot at the nape of her neck. Her skin was pale from the cold, freckles visible across her cheeks, and her eyes were sharp in the way of someone who missed very little. This was Sarah Keller, a federal investigator whose reputation rested on patience rather than spectacle. Years earlier, a case mishandled by local authorities had cost her a partner. Since then, she trusted evidence more than people, and silence more than promises. Behind her emerged two agents, their presence understated, faces neutral, hands visible. Sarah raised one gloved hand in greeting, stopping a few steps short of the door. "Ethan Walker?" she asked, her voice calm, carrying easily in the cold air. "That's me," Ethan replied. He did not step forward, but he did not block the door either. It was an invitation without surrender. Sarah's gaze flicked briefly to Rex, then to the interior of the garage. "We received a file early this morning," she said. "Incomplete, but compelling. We traced it here." She met Hannah's eyes then, recognition immediate. "Officer Brooks." Hannah nodded, emotion tightening her throat. She stood carefully, every movement deliberate. "You got it," she said. It was not a question. Sarah inclined her head once. "Enough of it," she replied. "Enough to act." She turned slightly, speaking into a radio clipped to her collar. Within minutes, another vehicle arrived, this one unmistakable. Daniel Mercer stepped out last, hands already cuffed, his coat rumpled for the first time, his polished confidence stripped away. In daylight, his face looked smaller, the smile gone, jaw clenched in disbelief. He did not look at Hannah. He did not look at Ethan. He stared straight ahead, as if refusing to acknowledge the place where his certainty had unraveled. There was no shouting, no dramatic pronouncement. The agents read him his rights quietly, efficiently. Mercer offered no resistance, only a tight laugh that faded quickly when no one responded. He was guided back into the vehicle, the door closing with a soft finality that felt heavier than any slam. Hannah exhaled, a long breath she had been holding since the ravine. Tears came then, not violent, not loud, but steady, tracing paths down her cheeks. Sarah stepped closer, placing a hand briefly on Hannah's arm, grounding her. "You did the hard part," she said. "You stayed alive." Ethan watched from the doorway, feeling strangely detached, as if the resolution belonged to someone else. He had not expected relief to feel so quiet. When Sarah turned to him, her expression softened. "You saved lives," she said simply. "I just didn't walk away," Ethan replied. It was the truth, and it was enough. Later, after statements were taken and vehicles departed, the garage felt larger, emptier in a good way. Hannah sat on the floor beside the box where the puppies slept, stronger now, their breathing more confident. She smiled as one stirred, tiny paws pushing clumsily against the others. "They made it," she said, wonder still coloring her voice. "They had help," Ethan answered, glancing at Rex, who lay nearby, eyes finally closed in rest. Arrangements came together quietly over the following days. Hannah was cleared, her name restored without ceremony. She declined interviews, declined praise. When asked what she wanted, she requested only to stay with the K9 unit long enough to train one of the puppies. The smallest of the three, the one who had nearly slipped away, responded to her touch with an immediate trust that felt like recognition. That pup would go with her. Another found a home with a family from town, a couple with tired smiles and a yard full of promise. The third remained, toddling uncertainly across the garage floor until it found Ethan's boot and settled there, tail thumping once as if the decision had been made without discussion. Ethan did not become a hero. He did not become wealthy, but a call came from the local rescue cooperative, an offer for steady work, for experience respected rather than forgotten. He accepted without fanfare. Some mornings were still hard, some nights still echoed. But now, when he opened the garage door, there was movement at his feet, warmth in the air, and a reason to step forward. On the first truly clear morning, sunlight spilled across the concrete as Ethan stood in the doorway. Rex lay beside him, solid and content, while the puppy ventured out, squinting into the brightness, unafraid. Ethan watched them both, feeling the quiet certainty of something beginning again. The storm had passed. What remained was not victory, but life, and for him that was enough. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, through a tired man who chooses not to walk away, a wounded woman who refuses to give up, or a loyal dog who listens when the world is screaming to be ignored. In a world that often feels cold, unjust, and overwhelming, this story reminds us that God's work is not always loud. Often it is carried out through ordinary people who choose compassion when it would be easier to choose silence. Ethan did not set out to be a hero. Hannah did not ask to be tested. Rex did not know he was saving lives. And yet, each of them became part of something greater than themselves. Perhaps that is how faith works in everyday life. Not as an escape from suffering, but as the strength to stand inside it and still do what is right. If you are watching this today, feeling exhausted, forgotten, or alone, remember this: God still sees you. Even in your smallest decisions, even in moments when you feel you have nothing left to give, your kindness can become someone else's miracle. The storm will not last forever. And when it passes, what remains is the life you chose to protect. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. We read every one. And if you believe in quiet miracles, in second chances, and in the power of compassion, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss stories like this. May God bless you and protect you. May He be your shelter when life feels harsh, your light when the road is unclear, and your strength when you feel too tired to continue. And may He place loyal companions, human or otherwise, on your path when you need them most. If you believe in God's protection and quiet miracles, write Amen in the comments below.